5 nights after the gas explosion that nearly killed me. I lay alone in my hospital room at 11:47 p.m. when the door opened. A police detective stepped inside, locked the door behind him, and pressed his hand over my mouth. The nurse's station was 20 feet away. No one came. No alarm sounded. The hallway stayed silent. I stared into his eyes and waited. Because a man with 40% burns cannot fight back. Then he whispered a name that destroyed my marriage. But let me start from the beginning. I appreciate you sitting down with me for this one. Before we begin, leave me a comment. Have you ever trusted someone for years, only to discover they were not who you thought they were? Just yes or no. I read every single one. A few details in this story have been shaped for narrative purposes. The message beneath them is what I hope you carry with you. 5 nights after the explosion at my flagship restaurant, I lay alone in room 508 at UCSF Medical Center with bandaged hands and a concussion that turned the fluorescent lights into needles. The pain medication had worn off an hour earlier, and I could feel every one of my 66 years pressed against that mattress. My name is Vernon Ashford. I built the Ashford Coastal Kitchen chain from a single seafood stall at Fisherman's Wharf in 1994 into 18 locations along the California coast. And at 11:47 p.m. on the 5th night, someone opened my door without knocking. Earlier that evening, my wife Celeste had visited. She held my hand, pressed her pregnant belly close to the bed rail, and whispered that the lawyers were handling everything, that the insurance adjusters were cooperating, that I should rest and let her manage. She smelled like jasmine and cold September air. And when she kissed my forehead, I believed the worst was behind me. After she left, the corridor settled into nighttime quiet. Cartwheels rolled somewhere distant. The ventilation hummed its flat, constant note. I lay watching the green glow of the heart monitor trace a line that said I was alive, and I tried to believe that was enough. The door handle turned with the careful precision of someone who did not want to make noise. I want you to understand something. I was not frightened. I had spent 30 years reading men across negotiating tables and loading docks, watching how they held their shoulders when they were bluffing, and where their eyes went when they were counting. So when a broad-shouldered man in an SFPD uniform stepped inside and locked the door behind him, I did not panic. I watched. He crossed the room in 8 steps. He leaned over me, close enough that I could smell stale coffee on his jacket and see the stitching on his shoulder patch, and pressed a firm hand over my mouth. His palm was dry and calloused. His eyes were not cruel, they were professional. "Don't make a sound," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you. Mr. Ashford, I need you to listen." I grabbed his wrist. Not to fight him off. That is what a frightened man would do, and I needed him to believe I was frightened. So I let my eyes go wide and waited. He said his name was Wade Stanton. He was 44, a detective, and he said it the way a man says his rank when he wants you to stop asking questions. He removed his hand and stepped back 1 pace. "Your wife is not managing your company," he said. "She is dismantling it." I said nothing. I let the words sit in the room like smoke. He opened the nightstand drawer, checked the closet, went through the pockets of my jacket on the back of the door, picked up my phone, turned it over, set it down. Every motion systematic and unhurried. And the whole time he kept talking about irregular contracts and supplier transfers and a woman who was not who I thought she was. But I had stopped listening to his words. I was watching his eyes. How do you explain to yourself that the man searching your hospital room knew exactly which drawer to open first, knew which room you were in before your own wife was called, and framed every question as concern while his hands cataloged every surface within reach? He found nothing. The evidence he wanted was not in room 508. It was somewhere he had not thought to look, with someone whose name he did not know. He straightened his jacket, left a business card and a warning wrapped in politeness on my tray table, and turned leave. His hand was on the door handle when he paused, leaned back slightly, and whispered a single name. I had never heard it before. It meant nothing to me in that moment, but the way he said it, quiet and deliberate, like a man placing a pin into a map, told me it was supposed to mean everything. And in that single word, the wife I thought I knew, the child she was carrying, and the empire I had built from nothing collapsed into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat against the mattress. His footsteps faded down the corridor. The heart monitor kept its steady line. The ventilation hummed. I lay there, staring at a ceiling I had memorized over 5 nights, understanding that something had broken that could not be repaired with insurance money and rest. But to understand why that name mattered, you need to go back. Back to a Thursday morning when the kitchen of my flagship restaurant exploded. Back further. Back to 1994, to a wharf, to a woman I loved, and to the day I decided the sea owed me a living. So let me go back. Back before the whispered name, before the detective in my room, before any of it. Back to the beginning. The first thing I ever sold was a pound of Dungeness crab from a folding table at Fisherman's Wharf in the summer of 1994, and the woman standing beside me believed I could turn that table into an empire before I believed it myself. Eleanor had driven us down from Eureka in a truck with a cooler strapped to the bed and $600 between us. She wore a canvas apron and cracked shells alongside me until her fingers bled. And when I told her we had cleared $90 by noon, she looked at me like I had handed her a diamond. "You know seafood," she told me that first morning. "And you know how to work. The rest you'll figure out." She was right. One stall became a storefront. The storefront became a restaurant. By 2005, we had 4 locations. By 2012, 9. By the time Eleanor was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2014, Ashford Coastal Kitchen had 14 restaurants and a headquarters on the Embarcadero with a view of the bay she had crossed with me 20 years earlier. She died on a Tuesday in October. Our daughter Thea was 24. "Are we going to be okay?" Thea asked me the morning after the funeral, still in her black dress. I told her yes, I kept that promise for 10 years. I thought I had learned how to love again, without betraying the memory of the woman who died believing in me. I was wrong about that too. I met Celeste at a hospitality marketing conference in Napa 3 years after Eleanor passed. She was younger, sharp, full of ideas about brand identity and coastal aesthetics that made me feel like the chain could become something beyond what I had imagined alone. We married a year later. She rebranded the restaurants, redesigned the menus, brought in a social media team that tripled our weekend reservations. 18 locations. She made me believe the empire had a second act. And she made me believe I deserved one. That was the life I was living on a Thursday morning in September 2025, when I drove to the Fisherman's Wharf flagship to check on emergency gas line repairs. Celeste had recommended the contractor herself. "A small outfit," she said. "Reliable, fast." The crew had been working since dawn, and when I arrived, the kitchen smelled wrong. Sharp. Chemical. The kind of smell that sits at the back of your throat and tells you something is leaking before your brain catches up. I was standing near the prep station when my phone rang. Celeste's name on the screen. "Vernon," she said, and her voice cracked with what sounded like joy. "I'm pregnant." I placed my hand on my chest and stood there grinning in a kitchen that smelled like gas, thinking about cribs and names and a 66-year-old man who was about to become a father again. I did not know that within 1 hour the room I was standing in would detonate. The blast came from everywhere at once. A percussive wall of heat and sound that lifted me off my feet and threw me sideways into the service counter. I remember the orange fireball rolling across the ceiling. I remember the taste of copper flooding my mouth. I remember my hands hitting something hot and the pain arriving a full second after the impact. The way thunder follows lightning. Then the smoke swallowed everything. Paramedics found me on the kitchen floor. My hands were burned. My head had struck the counter hard enough to crack the tile behind it. A man in blue gloves knelt beside me and said my hands would heal. I told him he clearly did not understand what those hands had built. They carried me out on a stretcher through the service entrance. The September air hit my face, and I could smell the bay underneath the smoke, salt and kelp cutting through charred wood. My vision was blurred but clearing, and as they loaded me into the ambulance, I turned my head and saw him, the contractor, standing outside the kitchen service door, arms at his sides, no panic, no urgency, no phone call to the fire department. Just a man watching the building burn, with the calm of someone reviewing a finished project. He was not running, he was not calling for help. He was watching the way a man watches when everything is going exactly according to plan. The ambulance doors closed, and I lost him. But I did not lose that image. It burned into my memory harder than the fire itself, harder than the pain in my hands, harder than the ringing in my skull. And it stayed there, waiting, through 5 days of morphine and fluorescent light, until a detective opened my door at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and everything I thought I knew began to fall apart. I did not tell the paramedics about the contractor. I did not tell the admitting nurse or the surgeon who stitched the burns on my palms. I kept that image to myself, folded into a corner of my memory where it sat like a coal that would not cool. And when I woke in room 508 the next morning, the first thing I saw was not my wife, not a doctor, not a nurse. It was Garrison Prescott. He was 60 years old, silver-haired, wearing a jacket that cost more than my first month's rent at the wharf. He sat in the chair beside my bed, holding a paper cup of hospital coffee, like a man with nowhere more important to be. He was the owner of Prescott Hospitality Group, a competitor I had known for the better part of a decade. The last time we had been in a room together, he had offered to buy my chain at 40% below market, and left without shaking my hand when I said no. That was 7 years ago. "You've built something remarkable, Vernon," he said, crossing one leg over the other. "Ashford Coastal Kitchen is an institution on this coast." The least I could do was check in. His voice was warm. His eyes were not. They moved across the room while he spoke, landing on the nightstand, the closet door, the tray table, cataloging surfaces the way a man catalogs inventory. I had watched men do that across negotiating tables for 30 years. I knew what it looked like when someone was counting what you had. "If there's anything you need," he said, "anything at all, the offer stands. It always has." How had Garrison Prescott known which room I was in before my own wife had been called up? I thanked him. I told him I appreciated the visit. He finished his coffee, left the paper cup on my tray table, and walked out with the unhurried stride of a man who had accomplished exactly what he came for. I stared at that cup for a long time. I never drank from it. Celeste arrived mid-afternoon. She came through the door with her eyes rimmed red, mascara smudged beneath her left eye, and her voice cracked on my name in a way that made my chest hurt worse than the concussion. She was 46. The former marketing director who had rebranded the entire chain's Pacific presence, and the woman who had made me believe, after Eleanor, that I was allowed to have a second act. She pressed her cheek against mine, careful of my bandaged hands, and held me. The most dangerous thing about love is how reasonable it makes unreasonable faith feel. Eleanor used to say something like that about her own mother. But I have come to think she was talking about all of us. After the tears and the relief and the questions about what the doctors had said, Celeste reached into her bag and pulled out a document organizer. It was leather, dark brown, monogrammed. I recognized it. It was from my desk at headquarters. She opened it on the bed and began outlining how she would handle things while I recovered. The regional suppliers, the franchise review scheduled for November, the insurance claim for the flagship. She had contact lists, timelines, delegation charts. Her voice was steady now. Efficient, the marketing director stepping back into command. "Let me do this," she said. "You've taken care of everything for 30 years. Let me take care of things now." She mentioned restructuring a few of the smaller import contracts. "Just streamlining," she said. "Nothing major." She said it the way people say things they want you to forget immediately. I lay there with my burned hands on the mattress and my wife's lavender shampoo in my nose, and I felt something I mistook for gratitude. She was handling everything. She had thought of everything. She had packed the organizer from my desk and driven to the hospital and arrived with a plan already built. I did not ask myself the obvious question. Not then. Looking back now, I understand what I missed. I was too busy being grateful to notice that she had not asked me what I needed. She had told me what she was going to do. The document organizer in her bag was from my own desk, packed before the fire trucks had finished hosing down the kitchen. She had walked into that hospital room with red eyes and a breaking voice, and a plan she had assembled while my restaurant was still burning. But I did not see it. I saw my wife. I saw her tears, and I believed every single one of them. I believed those tears. I want you to understand that. I believed the red eyes and the cracking voice and the document organizer and all of it, because I was a man lying in a hospital bed who needed his wife to be exactly who she appeared to be. The next morning she brought coffee from the place on the corner of Union and Fillmore. Dark roast, no sugar, a splash of whole milk. The order I had been drinking every morning for 20 years. The fact that she remembered it made me love her in a way that felt, for one brief moment, uncomplicated. She sat on the edge of the bed and took my bandaged hand and placed it on her belly. She did not say anything at first. She just held it there and looked at me, with the kind of light in her eyes that I had not seen since Eleanor. And I felt something open in my chest that I thought had closed permanently the day we buried my first wife. "We're going to need a bigger house," I said. She laughed. I did not care that it hurt my ribs. We spent that morning talking about names and nurseries and whether a boy born to a 66-year-old father would forgive him for being old enough to be his grandfather. The sun came through the hospital window and turned the room warm and golden, and I let myself believe the universe had given me one more chance. A late-life child. A second act. The kind of gift that arrives so late you know you do not deserve it. And you take it anyway. Because you are human, and you are tired, and you want it more than you have wanted anything in years. I have thought a great deal about the particular kind of blindness that love produces. Not the foolish kind. The kind that comes from 30 years of building something and believing the person beside you is building it too. That blindness does not make you stupid. It makes you generous. And generosity, in the wrong hands, is a weapon. On the third day, the conversation shifted. Celeste had her laptop open on the tray table, scrolling through supplier spreadsheets. And she mentioned, in the same casual tone she might use to describe a grocery list, that she was restructuring a few of the smaller import contracts. "Which contracts?" I asked. "Just the secondary connectors," she said, looking at the window instead of at me. "The regional distributors. I'll put together a summary for you when you're feeling better." I knew those contracts. I had negotiated every one of them personally. They were not secondary connectors. They were the primary supplier agreements linking our California locations to East Coast seafood distributors. They were the backbone that kept 18 restaurants stocked 6 days a week. Without them, we did not have a supply chain. We had a menu and a prayer. Celeste had an MBA. She had spent 4 years running marketing for the chain. She knew exactly what those contracts were, and she had just called them small. How do you weigh a set of suspicious numbers against the woman carrying your child? How do you hold those two things in your mind at the same time and decide which one is real? I asked for pudding. Vanilla. I asked the nurse to adjust the blinds. I yawned and told Celeste I was getting tired. And when she looked up from the laptop, I gave her the slow, unfocused smile of a man whose medication was making everything a little hazy. "Sounds like you've got it under control," I said. She smiled, warm, relieved. She closed the laptop and kissed my forehead and told me to rest. And when she walked out, I watched the door close and lay there listening to the IV drip count the seconds. I nodded and let it go, because that was what a tired, injured man who trusted his wife completely would do. That was the role I played, and I played it well. Because I had spent 30 years across negotiating tables, learning to keep my face still when the numbers did not add up. That evening, after the corridor went quiet and the nurse's station dimmed to its nighttime murmur, I lay in the dark and thought about Garrison Prescott in the chair that first morning. About the coffee I never touched. About the fact that he had been in my room before my own wife had been called. About the contracts Celeste had just described as small. About the document organizer packed before the fire trucks finished. I thought about all of it for a long time. And by the time the pain medication pulled me under, I was no longer entirely sure what I believed. 2 more days passed. The doubts did not leave. They sat in the corner of my mind like uninvited guests, quiet enough to ignore, but too present to forget. And then night 5 arrived. The pain medication had left me in a half-waking state where my thoughts moved too slowly to follow and too quickly to dismiss. The clock on the wall read 11:47 when I heard it. The door handle turning with the careful precision of someone who did not want to make noise. The door swung open without sound. A man in an SFPD uniform stepped inside and locked it behind him. He crossed the room in 8 deliberate steps, leaned over my bed, and pressed a firm hand over my mouth. His palm was dry. His breath smelled like coffee and leather. The shoulder patch on his uniform caught the glow from the heart monitor. I grabbed his wrist, not to fight. That is what a frightened man would do, and I needed this man to believe I was frightened. So I grabbed and I let my eyes go wide and I waited for him to speak. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need you to listen to me." He told me things about my wife, about redirected contracts, outside operators, a private investment group. He spoke with the measured urgency of a man delivering a warning, and his words were alarming enough that a trusting husband might have sat up and started asking questions. But I was not listening to his words. I was watching his eyes. I was not frightened. I want to be clear about that. I was watching. The way I had watched men across negotiating tables and loading docks for 30 years. And what I saw was a man whose mouth was saying one thing while his gaze did something else entirely. His eyes moved to the nightstand drawer, then the closet, then the jacket hanging on the back of the bathroom door. He was mapping the room. Every surface, every pocket. Every place a man might keep a document, or a drive, or a piece of paper that did not belong in a hospital. "Is there anything in this room that belongs to the company?" he asked. "Documents, a laptop, a storage device of any kind?" There it was. The question underneath all the other questions, the reason he had come. "I don't keep work things here," I said, letting my voice tremble just enough. "My wife brought some paperwork yesterday, but she took it home." He moved to the nightstand and opened the drawer. He checked the closet shelf. He reached into my jacket pockets and turned them inside out with 2 fingers, careful not to disturb the fabric. He picked up my phone, looked at the lock screen, set it back. And through all of it, his face stayed perfectly composed. The face of a man conducting a routine welfare check on a patient he was concerned about. But his eyes lingered on the nightstand drawer half a second too long. That was his tell. That was the moment I knew with certainty that this was not a warning visit. He had not come to help me. He had come to find something. The warning was the wrapping paper. Just alarming enough to keep my attention on his words, while his hands catalogued every surface in the room. He straightened his jacket. He placed a business card on my tray table. "If you find anything," he said, "documents, records, anything out of place, call this number directly, not the main line." Then he paused at the door. He leaned back and whispered something. A single name, spoken so quietly it barely displaced the air between us. I kept my face blank. I let him leave. His footsteps faded down the corridor. The heart monitor beeped, the ventilation hummed, and I lay there in the silence and let the performance fall away. Here is what Wade Stanton did not know. 3 days before the explosion, while reviewing quarterly projections at my desk, I had noticed irregularities in the supplier data, numbers that did not match, authorization codes on invoices I had never approved. I did not understand what they meant yet, but I understood that they should not exist. So I copied everything onto a portable drive and gave it to the one person at the company I trusted without reservation, my chief financial officer. And I told him to keep it in his office safe until I asked for it. Stanton had searched every inch of room 508 and come away empty-handed. That told me 2 things. Whoever sent him did not know about the drive, and I had approximately 1 day before they started looking harder. I picked up my phone and called the one man I trusted with everything I had left. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives in a hospital room at 4 in the morning, when the medication has worn off and the pain is the only honest thing left in your life. Stanton was gone. The business card sat on my tray table, and the name he had whispered hung in the air like a frequency I could not yet tune. I lay there in the pre-dawn blue and cataloged everything I knew. The explosion at the flagship. Celeste arriving with a document organizer packed before the fire trucks finished. Prescott in my room before my wife had been called. The supplier contracts she had called small. And now a detective who had searched my nightstand while pretending to save me. I had given that drive to my chief financial officer 3 days before the gas line blew. Not because I understood what was happening, but because something in the numbers had not sat right, and I had learned a long time ago to trust the feeling that comes before understanding. The drive was safe. The detective had found nothing. That meant whoever sent him believed the evidence was still in play, and they did not know where to look next. My only advantage was that they thought I was broken. So I decided to be broken. I practiced the shuffle in the dark, walking from the bed to the bathroom with my IV stand and letting my feet drag across the linoleum. I practiced the trembling hand, the unfocused stare, the grateful, confused smile of a man whose concussion had stolen his sharpness. I watched my reflection in the darkened window and adjusted until the performance was convincing. The weak do not threaten. The weak do not investigate. The weak sign whatever is put in front of them and say thank you. A 66-year-old man in a hospital gown is not a soldier. But I had been in the seafood business long enough to know that the most dangerous creature in Monterey Bay is the one that looks like a rock. At 6 in the morning, I picked up the phone and dialed the office landline at Ashford headquarters. Not a cell phone, not an email. The landline. Because certain conversations should travel through wires that do not store data in someone else's cloud. Cedric Townsend answered on the 3rd ring. He was 52 years old, my chief financial officer, and he had kept the company's books for 2 decades. He was the kind of man who noticed when a decimal point moved one place to the right, and could not sleep until he understood why. He answered from his office because it was the only line he trusted, and I loved him for that. "Cedric," I said, "the drive I gave you before the accident, you still have it." "In the office safe," he said, "untouched." "Good. I need you to pull every supplier contract that has been modified or initiated since September 1st. Every single one. I need you to cross-reference the authorization codes against my personal approvals. And I need you to do it without telling anyone at headquarters what you are doing. I want you to understand something about Cedric Townsend. He was not a brave man. He was not a fighter. He was an accountant who loved spreadsheets the way some men love fishing, with patience and precision, and a quiet faith that the numbers would eventually tell the truth. That made him the most dangerous person I could have called. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully that he had already noticed something. Several of the contracts modified since my accident carried Celeste's electronic signature. That was expected. But they also carried a cosign from Prescott's office. And that was not normal procedure. The company's outside counsel had never co-signed supplier agreements. There was no reason for it. No precedent. That's exactly why I'm calling you and not anyone else, I said. Watch everything. Trust no one. He told me he understood. And then he was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that comes before a man says something he wishes he did not have to say. There was one more thing he said. A new vendor account had been opened just 2 weeks after my accident. It routed payments to a shell company registered in Nevada, an entity with no public filings, no website, no listed employees. The amounts were modest. The routing was not. And the authorized signatory on the account was not Celeste. It was someone whose name I had not heard in 20 years. A name that had nothing to do with seafood and everything to do with the kind of man who builds things in the dark and waits for other people to fall into them. I told Cedric to lock the drive in a second location. I told him to come see me in person. And I did not sleep again that night. Cedric came to see me the next afternoon. He walked into room 508 carrying a manila folder the way a man carries a loaded weapon, close to his body, angled away from the door, as if someone in the corridor might reach out and take it. He did not say hello. He closed the door, pulled the visitor chair to the bed, and spread 16 printed invoices across my hospital blanket. Every one of them carried Celeste's electronic authorization code. Every one of them routed to suppliers I had never contracted with. Not one of those suppliers had ever delivered a single crate to any of our 18 locations. Cedric had checked. He had called every listed phone number. 3 were disconnected. 5 rang to voicemail boxes that had never been set up. The rest did not exist at all. How much total? I asked. 2.3 million, he said. Spread across 16 transactions since September. Each one sized below the threshold that triggers our quarterly audit. Whoever designed this knew exactly where our controls stopped looking. I ran my finger across the authorization codes. I knew those codes. I had built the system that generated them, and I knew that the threshold Cedric was describing, the number below which an invoice passed without review, was not public information. It was not in any manual a contractor or outside attorney would have access to. It lived in a spreadsheet on Cedric's own server, shared with exactly 3 people: Cedric, me, and the woman who had signed every one of these invoices. I looked at those 16 pages spread across my lap and I understood something simple and terrible. My wife had not made a mistake. She had made a plan. Cedric left the invoices with me, tucked inside a magazine, and walked out the way he had come in, quiet and careful and ordinary. I waited until evening. Then I picked up the phone and called a number I had memorized 40 years ago. Lloyd Callahan was 68 years old, a retired harbor master out of Monterey who had fished alongside my father in the 1970s and still knew every commercial seafood operator between Half Moon Bay and Big S. Sir. He had a voice like gravel rolling downhill, a memory that forgot nothing, and the kind of loyalty that does not require explanation because it was built before either of us understood what the word meant. Lloyd, I said, I need your help. How do you explain to a man you have known for 40 years that the woman you married has been stealing from you while you lay in a hospital bed recovering from an explosion she may have arranged? You do not explain, you state facts and let the silence do the rest. I told him about the invoices, about the shell companies, about the detective who had searched my room, about the contractor who had been working on the gas line the morning everything burned. I asked him to trace that contractor. I asked him to cross-reference the shell company names against known import operators on the Central Coast. You want me to find the contractor? He asked. I want you to find everyone, I said. Give me names, Lloyd, every single one. Give me 48 hours, he said. He called back in 4. His voice had changed. The easy Monterey drawl was gone, replaced by something flat and careful. The voice of a man choosing every word because he knows the wrong one will cause damage. He had found the contractor. The outfit was called Pacific Ridge Services, a small firm registered in Reno. Lloyd had pulled their state filings and commercial license. The license was valid. The insurance bond was current. The owner's name matched the permits filed with the city for the gas line work at my flagship. But the owner was dead. Heart attack, according to the death certificate filed in Washoe County. And the date on that certificate was 3 days before the explosion. A dead man's company had repaired my gas line. A dead man's license had been used to pull the permits. And a dead man's insurance bond was still listed as active on a job completed after his funeral. There was one more thing, Lloyd said. One of the shell company names on Cedric's invoices. A supplier called Bayline Pacific Imports. Matched a seafood import license that had been revoked by NOAA Fisheries 3 years ago for falsified origin documentation. The company did not just lack deliveries. It legally could not exist. I thanked Lloyd. I hung up. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and understood that whoever had built this machine had built it to run without fingerprints. Through dead men and dissolved companies and revoked licenses. The trail was being erased faster than I could follow it. How does a dead man rig a gas line 3 days after his own funeral? That was the question I could not stop turning over. The trail was dissolving behind me like fog burning off the bay. And if I did not move fast enough, the only evidence left would be ash and paperwork that pointed nowhere. I called Lloyd back the next morning and walked him through the logic. If the contractor was dead before the work began, then someone had used his identity, his license, his insurance bond, his city access credentials. Somebody had walked into a municipal clerk's office with a dead man's paperwork. Filed for a gas permit on my flagship restaurant, and nobody had checked. Nobody had called the number on the application or matched the signature against a living hand. The death certificate is real, Lloyd said. Filed in Washoe County. Heart attack. His business was dissolved 2 months before your kitchen blew. But the city of San Francisco still shows an active permit under his license number for the wharf location. Issued 3 weeks before the explosion. A dissolved company, a dead owner, an active permit. Someone had rebuilt the identity of a man who no longer existed and used it to walk through every checkpoint without leaving a living fingerprint. Who owns Pacific Ridge now? I asked. That's where it gets ugly, Lloyd said. Give me another day. I want you to understand what it feels like to wait in a hospital bed for a phone call that you know will change everything. It is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is a man staring at ceiling tiles he has memorized, listening to the IV drip count seconds, smelling the breakfast tray he cannot touch because his stomach has turned to concrete. Celeste had visited the evening before. Her perfume was still on the pillow. I could smell lavender every time I turned my head, and every time I smelled it I thought about the company that had burned my restaurant and whose owner I was about to learn. Lloyd called back the following afternoon. His voice had gone flat in a way I had only heard once before, 30 years ago, when he told me my father's boat had gone down off Point Sur. I traced the corporate chain, he said. Pacific Ridge Services is owned by a Nevada holding entity called Bayline Capital LLC. Bayline's sole member is a revocable trust filed with the Clark County Recorder's Office. He paused. The trust's beneficiary is Celeste Ashford. I did not speak. The heart monitor beeped, the IV dripped. The fog pressed against the window. I gripped the bed rail with my free hand and held on, because the room had shifted under me, and I needed something solid. Say that again? I said. Celeste Ashford. Filed 14 months ago. Before you were ever hurt. 14 months. She had been building the machine that would destroy me for 14 months. And during every one of those months, she had slept beside me and asked about my day. She had kissed me good morning. She had poured my coffee. She had sat across from me at dinner and talked about the restaurants and the expansion and the future she was building with me, while quietly, methodically, in filing offices and holding companies and trusts registered in another state. She was building something else entirely. My wife owned the company that burned my restaurant. The explosion was not an accident. It was not negligence. It was not a contractor's error. It was architecture. Planned, filed, funded, and executed 14 months before the gas line blew. I swallowed. My mouth tasted like nothing, like the inside of an envelope, like the absence of every flavor I had ever associated with the life I thought I was living. I asked Lloyd one more question before I hung up. Who was the attorney of record on the trust filing? He read me the name. And the room, which had already shifted once, shifted again. Garrison Prescott, the silver-haired man who had sat in the chair beside my bed on my first morning in this room, holding a paper cup of coffee and telling me he was there to help. The man who had offered to protect my interests. The man whose eyes had scanned every surface in room 508 the same way the detectives had, counting what I had and where I kept it. He had filed the trust. He had built the corporate chain. He had been Celeste's attorney of record 14 months before anyone tried to kill me. And then he had walked into my hospital room and smiled. I hung up the phone. I placed it on the tray table beside the untouched breakfast. And I lay there in the silence and let the last of what I had believed about my marriage burn down to the foundation. Now I knew two names, Celeste and Prescott. My wife and my attorney. Bound together in a trust document filed 14 months before someone used a dead man's license to blow up my kitchen. But there was a question I had not yet asked. And it had been sitting in the back of my mind like a stone I was afraid to turn over. I had been married to Celeste for 6 years, and in all that time I had never once asked her how she met the family attorney. I called Lloyd and asked him to go deeper. Not into the companies, into the relationship. How far back did Prescott and Celeste go? How did they find each other? Lloyd said he would need to pull gala registrations, consulting firm records, hotel bookings. I told him to pull whatever he needed. He called back the next day. What he found went back 7 years. Prescott had appeared at a restaurant industry gala in Napa under the banner of a hospitality consulting firm. Celeste had attended the same event. I had not. I was in Monterey that weekend, closing the expansion deal that added 3 locations to the chain. Prescott had spent the evening at Celeste's table. He had followed up with emails, lunches, a mentorship that looked generous and felt flattering. He spent months cultivating her before he ever mentioned my company by name. He didn't approach your business, Lloyd said, his voice barely above a whisper. He approached your wife 7 years ago, at a dinner you didn't attend. 7 years. How many dinners had Prescott sat at my table? Eaten my food, shaken my hand, and every single time he was measuring how much longer before he could take everything I had. I remembered the evening Celeste came home from that Napa dinner. She had been glowing. She talked about a man she had met, who understood seafood supply chains better than anyone in the industry. I told her to invite him to dinner. I said those words. I opened my front door and welcomed in the man who would spend the next 7 years dismantling my life. The dinner tray arrived that evening. Roast chicken and something with rosemary that smelled like Eleanor's kitchen, and I could not touch it. I sat with the phone warm against my ear and my thumb pressed hard against the bridge of my nose, and I waited for something inside me to break. It did not break. It went cold. Thea called at 8 that evening. My daughter was 34. A marine biology professor who had kept her distance from Ashford Coastal Kitchen since Eleanor died, but who had never, stopped watching the people inside it. Her voice was unsteady when she spoke, the way it used to sound when she was 12 and trying to tell me something she thought I would not want to hear. Dad, I know you'll think this is about me not accepting her, she said. It's not. I need you to listen to me. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Stepdaughter jealousy. The old wound of a girl who lost her mother and resented the woman who replaced her. I felt the dismissal forming in my throat like a reflex, automatic and comfortable. And then I heard Eleanor's voice in my memory, clear as the day she said it. Listen to your daughter. She sees things you don't. So I listened. Thea told me she had watched Celeste for years. She had seen how Celeste inserted herself into company decisions that had nothing to do with marketing. She had noticed old friends disappearing from my calendar, invitations that stopped arriving, phone calls that were never returned. And she had seen Celeste going through my desk at home, late at night, pulling documents from drawers and photographing them with her phone. My daughter had been carrying this alone for 2 years because she was afraid I would choose my second wife over my own child. And the worst part is, she was probably right. A year ago, I would have... How long have you known? I asked. 2 years, she said. I was afraid you'd choose her over me. This time, I will not stay silent. I pressed my eyes shut. The salt stung behind my lids and I held it there because I would not cry in this room. Not yet. Not until this was finished. Thea said there was one more thing. The documents she had seen on my desk, the ones Celeste had been photographing and moving. Thea had photographed them first. She had 47 pictures on her phone. She had never shown them to anyone. She had been waiting for me to be ready to see them. Do you want to see them? She asked. Bring them, I said. Bring everything. While I waited for Thea to bring the photographs, the investigation opened a second front I had not expected. Cedric called me that afternoon, and his voice carried a tension I had never heard from a man who treated spreadsheets like scripture. He told me everything that happened at that coffee shop, in the kind of detail a man only remembers when he knows it matters. Cedric Townsend had not been inside a coffee shop in 14 years. He kept a French press in his office and considered that sufficient. So when Bryn Hollister, a 28-year-old accounts payable clerk who had processed every invoice in the seafood division for 3 years, asked him to meet her at a place called Bay Grind, 2 blocks from headquarters, he knew something was wrong. She was already seated when he arrived. Her hands were wrapped around a latte she had not touched. The coffee shop had exposed brick walls and a chalkboard menu, and the kind of ambient noise that swallows quiet conversations, which was why she had chosen it. The espresso machine hissed behind the counter. Street noise from the Embarcadero filtered through the prop door. And Bryn Hollister sat very still and told Cedric something that changed the shape of everything we thought we knew. For 6 weeks, she said, she had been processing seafood import invoices with origin codes that did not match the actual shipments. Chilean sea bass labeled as domestic Pacific catch. Farm shrimp stamped as wild-caught Monterey. The codes on the paperwork did not correspond to any supplier in any database she could access. She had been told it was a temporary compliance workaround, a labeling update tied to new supplier coding systems. But I checked, Mr. Townsend, she said. The codes don't exist. Cedric had spent 20 years making sure every number in Ashford Coastal Kitchen's books told the truth. Now he was looking at 6 weeks of numbers that had been taught to lie. Who told you to process them? He asked. The instructions came from Prescott's office, she said. Always by email. Always from an assistant's address, never signed. Not signed. Not traceable to a name. Routed through a law office that had no business issuing supply chain directives to an accounts payable clerk. Whoever had designed the instruction chain had built deniability into every link. Bryn told Cedric she had known the codes were wrong from the first week. She had a 3-year memory of what real supplier documentation looked like. And these invoices had the weight of real paper and the soul of forgery. She did not know who to tell. She did not trust anyone at headquarters. She was afraid that reporting it would end her career. Or worse, make her the person blamed for what she had been forced to process. So she had done the only thing she could think of. She had started recording. Every mismatched shipment, every crate with one label being reprocessed with another. She used her personal phone, held low at her hip on the loading dock, capturing video with timestamps and dock numbers clearly visible. She had over 30 recordings. 6 weeks of evidence cataloged by a clerk who made $42,000 a year and had more courage than every executive in the building combined. She slid the phone across the table. Cedric picked it up and pressed play on the first video. Grainy footage of a loading dock. Crates stacked 4 high. A worker peeling origin labels and replacing them with new ones. The date stamp in the corner. The dock number visible on the concrete pillar behind. I recorded everything, Bryn said. Every shipment. I didn't know what else to do. Cedric watched 3 videos in silence. He understood immediately what he was seeing. This was not a paperwork error. This was not financial fraud alone. Falsifying the origin of seafood imports across state lines was a violation of the Lacey Act. Federal territory. The kind of crime that brought NOAA enforcement and federal prosecutors to your door. Bryn, do you understand what these recordings show? He said. This is a federal crime. That's why I came to you, she said, and not to her. Cedric scrolled through the videos one by one. 31 recordings, each one clear, each one dated, each one showing the same operation repeated on different shipments at the same dock. And then he reached the last video. The timestamp was from 3 days earlier, in the background of the loading dock. Clearly visible over the shoulder of the worker relabeling the crates was a figure Cedric recognized immediately. Silver hair, bar jacket, hands in his pockets, a phone pressed to his ear. He was not hiding. He was not looking over his shoulder. He was standing in plain sight, watching the operation with the calm of a man reviewing inventory. Garrison Prescott. Not directing the fraud from behind unsigned emails, standing on the dock, watching his work. Cedric brought me the dock video that evening, and I watched Prescott stand in the background of a loading dock with his hands in his pockets, like a man checking on a renovation. But before I could decide what to do with it, Celeste moved first. Cedric called the next morning from the stairwell at headquarters. Speaking so quietly I had to press the phone against my skull to hear. Celeste had sent a company-wide email scheduling a mandatory logistics presentation for that afternoon. She had named Bryn Hollister as the presenter. I felt something drop in my chest. The young woman who had risked everything to bring Cedric the truth was about to be forced to stand in front of 18 colleagues and sell the lie. Cedric went to the conference room and stood in the doorway. He told me everything he saw. Bryn was already at the front of the room when the team filed in. Celeste sat in the back row, with her legs crossed and a half-smile that looked like encouragement and functioned like a leash. The fluorescent lights caught the tremor in Bryn's laser pointer as she clicked to the first slide. The new coding structure streamlines our import documentation and reduces processing time, Bryn said, her voice steady but pitched slightly too high. The way a voice sounds when it is being held together by willpower alone. She walked 18 people through the falsified import system. The same system she had confessed to Cedric days earlier. The same codes that did not exist. The same relabeling operation that constituted a federal crime. And Celeste sat in the back and watched her do it. Because by making Bryn present, she had turned a terrified clerk into the public architect of the fraud. If the scheme ever surfaced, every person in that room would remember Bryn at the podium, walking them through it with a slideshow and a pointer. Cedric told me later that the hardest thing he had ever done in his career was stand in that doorway and watch a young woman he had promised to protect read a script that would destroy her. He did nothing, because acting too soon would destroy them all. After the presentation, Celeste found Cedric in the hallway. Her heels clicked on the tile as she approached, and her perfume arrived before she did. She touched his arm the way people touch things they intend to move. Cedric. With Vernon recovering, I think it's prudent to have a third party verify our books, she said. Just good governance. I've engaged an outside accounting firm to conduct a routine compliance audit. Effective immediately. I'm sure you understand. Her tone was pleasant. Her eyes were not. Of course, Cedric said. I have nothing to hide. I know you don't, she said. That's why this should be painless. Cedric did not have a word for a woman who could smile at you in a hallway and announce she was about to dismantle your career using the very records he had kept honest for 20 years. He told me later he stood in that hallway after she walked away and drank a cup of water from a plastic pitcher and swallowed every word he wanted to say. He understood what the audit was. It was not governance, it was construction. Celeste was building a frame. If the fraudulent invoices were ever discovered, the outside auditors would find them in Cedric's department, processed through his systems, authorized under codes that ran through his servers. The fact that he had not signed them would not matter. The fact that they sat in his jurisdiction would. She was not just stealing from me. She was preparing to blame the people I trusted most. Bryn for the operations, Cedric for the books. Two people who had done nothing wrong except work for a company whose owner had married the wrong woman. Cedric came to room 508 that night. He sat in the visitor chair and laid it out without embellishment. Celeste was moving faster than we had anticipated. She had made Bryn her scapegoat, and Cedric her next target. The outside audit would begin within days. Once it started, anything Cedric touched would become evidence of his involvement rather than his investigation. The window was closing. If we wait for more evidence, he said, there won't be anyone left to use it. I stared at the ceiling. The heart monitor beeped. The IV dripped. I thought about Bryn standing at that podium with a trembling pointer. I thought about Cedric drinking water in a hallway because he could not say what needed to be said. I thought about the people who had trusted me to protect them, and how badly I had failed at that so far. Then I said 2 words. Call Thea. Thea answered on the second ring. Cedric had his instructions. He was not going back to the office. He was going south. Cedric left San Francisco at 12 minutes past midnight, driving Highway 1 with a portable hard drive in his briefcase and a gas station coffee turning cold in the cup holder. I had told him not to stop for anything until he reached Lloyd Callahan's front door in Monterey. The fog was thick enough to swallow his headlights whole. He drove 2 hours through it with both hands on the wheel, watching the white line disappear and reappear like a pulse. Lloyd was waiting on the porch when Cedric pulled into the gravel driveway at 2:15 in the morning. The porch light had been burning since my call. Lloyd came down the steps in a flannel shirt and reading glasses. Cedric handed him the drive without ceremony. Everything is here, Cedric said. 20 years of books, Bryn's recordings, the invoice trail, all of it. I was on speakerphone from room 508 listening to gravel crunch under their shoes and the salt air off the bay drift through what sounded like an open kitchen window. Lloyd plugged the drive into his workstation with a quiet click that I heard more clearly than my own breathing. I'll have this cross-referenced against the server backups by morning, Lloyd said. Good, I told them. Cedric, don't go back to the office. Not tomorrow, not next week. Let the audit find an empty desk. There was a silence on the line. I could hear Cedric flexing his stiff hands, releasing the grip of a 2-hour drive. He understood what I was doing. Celeste had ordered her outside auditors to tear through his department. If they arrived and found Cedric gone, the records relocated, and nothing left to seize, the frame she was building would collapse under its own weight. She would have pointed every auditor in the city at an empty room. I had spent my career building a supply chain where every crate of fish could be traced from ocean to table. That same instinct for traceability was going to save the man who had kept my books honest for 2 decades. Celeste had altered the chain, but she had not erased the original. 6 days later, Lloyd called. I was alone in room 508. The window was dark. The heart monitor had become such a constant companion that I no longer heard it unless it changed rhythm. Lloyd's voice came through the phone with the controlled precision of a man who had triple-checked his findings and was still angry about what they showed. "The server doesn't lie," he said. "The backup syncs every 72 hours. I've pulled 3 months of sync records. Every one of Cedric's authorization timestamps predates the modified entries by weeks. Someone went into those files after Cedric signed off and changed the numbers." I gripped the bed rail until my knuckles ached. "How many files?" "Every single invoice that was flagged in the preliminary audit. All of them altered after Cedric's original approval, and the modification logs all point to the same place." "Where?" "A single terminal. Registered to Suite 1140 at the Prescott Building on Montgomery Street. Prescott's own office. He had not even used a different computer. That is how certain they were that I would never look. That is how little respect they had for the man lying in a hospital bed with burns on 40% of his body. They had walked into my company's servers from Prescott's own desk and rewritten my CFO's records. And they had not bothered to cover their tracks because they believed I was already finished. "So they didn't just steal from me," I said. "They tried to make it look like Cedric did it." "That is exactly what they did. And they left every fingerprint along the way." I sat with that for a moment. The IV dripped. Outside, a siren passed on Parnassus Avenue and faded into the distance. "There is one more thing," Lloyd said, and his voice shifted in a way that told me he had saved the worst for last. "Mixed in with the altered files. I found a draft document. Never sent, never finalized. It was titled Petition for Conservatorship, Vernon R. Ashford." The room went very still. "It was dated September 3rd, Lloyd continued. 2 days before the explosion at the Fisherman's Wharf flagship." I closed my eyes. Prescott had drafted a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent before the gas line was ever touched. The legal capture was supposed to come first. When it proved too slow, they moved to something faster. "This is no longer a thread, Vernon," Lloyd said. "It's a rope, and it is long enough to hang every one of them." I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling I had memorized over weeks of recovery. He was right. It was a rope, and I intended to use it. The rope Lloyd had described was real. The conservatorship petition, the altered invoices, the terminal logs, all of it pointed to a conspiracy that had been in motion for over a year. But lying in the dark at 3 in the morning, it was not the conspiracy that kept me awake. It was the pregnancy. The conspiracy had documents. It had timelines and terminal IDs and modification logs. I could fight it because I could see it. But the thing turning over in my mind at 3 a.m. was something I could not put in a file the way Celeste had told me she was pregnant. She told me on a Tuesday. I remembered because I had signed the Monterey expansion papers that morning. And when she came to my office that evening with tears in her eyes and her hands shaking, I had felt something I thought was gone from my life. The raw, unguarded joy of a man who believed he was being given one more chance at fatherhood. I held her in my office chair and pressed my face against her stomach and laughed for the first time in months. That was late August, 2 weeks before the explosion. Now I lay in room 508 and pressed my fingers against my temples and worked backward through the calendar. The green glow of the heart monitor was the only light. The corridor smelled of night shift disinfectant. I counted. Celeste's business trips to Los Angeles had stopped abruptly in June. The calls she took in the hallway, always stepping out of whatever room I was in, had started in May. The pregnancy announcement came in late August, the same week. I now realized that Prescott had been drafting a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent. I had wanted that child. I want you to understand that. Even now, lying in that hospital bed with burns healing on my body and betrayal healing nowhere, I wanted the child to be mine. I wanted one thing in this entire catastrophe to be real. But the timing was not a coincidence. Nothing about Celeste had been a coincidence for a very long time. The pregnancy had arrived at exactly the moment it would be most useful. Under California law, A wife carrying her husband's child has vastly stronger standing in conservatorship proceedings. She becomes not just a spouse, but a mother, protecting the interests of an unborn heir. Prescott would have known that. He had practiced family law for 30 years before switching to corporate acquisition. The pregnancy was not separate from the conspiracy. It was the legal foundation for it. I lay there until the ceiling tiles began to emerge in the gray light of morning. The IV dripped. My breathing was the loudest sound in the room. I had arrived at a question I did not want to ask. And there was only one way to answer it. What kind of man orders a paternity test on his unborn child from a hospital bed while his wife believes he is too broken to tie his own shoes? The kind of man who has learned over the course of several terrible weeks that the woman sleeping in his guest room has been conspiring to take everything he built. That kind of man, at 8 o'clock. I picked up the hospital phone and called a private genetics clinic in Palo Alto. I used my own name. I was done hiding. I need a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, I told the intake coordinator. I need it done quietly and I need it done correctly. The woman on the other end of the line explained the process in a clinical voice that I appreciated for its total absence of judgment. The test required a maternal blood sample 10 milliliters, standard draw, and a paternal cheek swab. Results in 72 hours once both samples arrived at the lab. I had my cheek swab done by noon. A nurse on the burn unit did it, without asking questions. Because I was Vernon Ashford, and I still owned this hospital's largest charitable endowment. And some doors never fully close no matter how badly you are broken. Now I needed Celeste's blood. I stared at the extra pillow she had brought from home, still carrying the faint trace of her perfume. I thought about how to ask a woman for a blood sample without telling her why. And as I worked through the possibilities, I remembered something small and strange that I had dismissed weeks ago. Celeste had canceled her prenatal appointment 3 times in a row. Each time a different excuse. Each time at the last minute. A woman who wants a healthy baby does not avoid her doctor. A woman who is hiding something about the baby does. Bad instincts are rarely wrong. I had ignored mine for months. I was not going to ignore them now. Celeste's canceled appointments had told me what I needed to know. Now a clinic in Palo Alto was going to confirm it. Thea had done her part. She had arranged for Celeste's blood to be drawn during what Celeste believed was a routine prenatal screening at UCSF, and the sample had reached the Palo Alto lab within hours. 72 hours later, I checked myself out of the hospital for the first time since the explosion, and drove south on the 101 with my discharge papers unsigned, and my hands steady on the wheel. The receptionist at the clinic smiled at me the way people smile at someone they feel sorry for, and I knew the results before she handed me the envelope. They put me in a private consultation room. White walls, new carpet, antiseptic air. The door clicked shut behind me, and I sat in a chair designed for comfort, and opened an envelope designed to end a marriage. The report was 2 pages. The relevant line was on the first page, halfway down. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. Not low. Not unlikely. Not within the margin of biological variation. 0. I read it 3 times. The black ink sat clean and final against the cream-colored paper, and each time I read it, the number did not change. I folded the paper along its original creases and put it back in the envelope with the precision of a man who had decided he would not break down in this room. I pressed my thumb along the sharp crease of the fold and felt the edge of the paper like a blade against my skin. I am going to tell you something about grief that no one warns you about. The second time is not easier than the first. When Eleanor died, I lost the woman I had loved for 31 years. Sitting in that consultation room in Palo Alto, I lost the child I thought I was going to raise. And I lost him to a man who had been sleeping with my wife while drafting legal documents to take my company. The grief for Eleanor had been clean. It was the grief of losing something real. This grief was different. This was the grief of discovering that what you lost had never existed in the first place. I sat there until my breathing was even. Then I stood up and walked through the lobby without looking at the receptionist and pushed through the glass doors into a November morning that was flat and gray and smelled of eucalyptus from the trees lining the parking lot. I got into the car and closed the door and sat in the silence. And then the name came back to me. The night Stanton had appeared in room 508 before I was fully conscious. Before I understood what was happening. He had leaned over my bed and whispered something. I had caught only a fragment of what sounded like a surname, spoken with a familiarity that did not belong in a hospital room at midnight. I had written it off as medication fog, a word that did not connect to anything. Now it connected to everything. The nursery list. Thea had photographed it 3 weeks ago during one of her visits to the house, and neither of us had understood why one detail mattered. Celeste had written a name at the top of the planning sheet, the name she had chosen for the baby. It was not an Ashford name. It was not a family name from either side that I recognized. I had assumed it was something she liked from a book or a film. It was a Prescott family name. His grandmother's maiden name, to be precise. She had named the baby after his real father's family. She had written it on a list in my house. On paper I paid for. In a nursery I would have built with my own hands if the explosion had not put me in a hospital bed first. And Stanton had whispered that name because he knew. He had always known whose child Celeste was carrying. The pregnancy was never an accident and never a gift. It was the final instrument. Under California law, an unborn heir strengthens every claim a wife can make against her husband's estate. The child was not meant to be mine. The child was meant to replace me. I sat in that parking lot for 45 minutes. The engine was off. The eucalyptus swayed in a wind I could not feel through the closed windows. I held the envelope on my lap, and I thought about every moment of the past year with the clarity of a man who has finally stopped hoping he is wrong. Then I started the car and drove north. I did not drive to the hospital. I did not drive home. I drove to 450 Golden Gate Avenue in San Francisco, parked on the street, and walked into the FBI field office without an appointment. I asked to speak to someone about fraud, arson, and conspiracy. And I brought Thea's 47 photographs with me. The FBI had listened. They had taken my documents, copied the hard drive, and told me someone would be in touch. I drove back to the hospital feeling for the first time in weeks like a man with a plan. Then I walked into room 508 and found a manila envelope on my pillow, with the Superior Court of California seal embossed in the corner. I stood there for a moment, looking at it. The room smelled the way it always did, antiseptic and recycled air, but it felt different now. It felt like a cage. I tore the envelope open, and the crisp sound of paper separating from glue was the loudest thing in the room. The filing was 4 pages. Celeste had petitioned the Superior Court for conservatorship under California Probate Code Section 1801, claim I was cognitively impaired and unable to manage my business affairs. The petition requested that a conservator be appointed to oversee all financial and operational decisions for Ashford Coastal Kitchen, effective immediately pending a competency hearing. The petition was supported by a signed cognitive assessment from a Dr. Neville Osborne, a physician I had never met, never spoken to, and never seen. His assessment described me as demonstrating persistent cognitive deficits consistent with post-traumatic encephalopathy, rendering me unable to manage financial and business affairs without supervised conservatorship. It described tests I never took. It referenced a consultation that never occurred. It listed symptoms I did not have. I ran my index finger along the line where Osborne's signature sat. It was clean and confident. The signature of a man who had been paid to write lies about a stranger's mind. I want you to imagine reading a document that describes your own brain as broken, written by a man you have never met, filed by a woman who kissed you goodnight 2 days ago. And know that if a single judge believes it, you will lose the legal right to make decisions about your own life. Your company, your assets, your home, your name. All of it handed to someone else because a piece of paper says you are no longer capable of holding them. That is what I held in my hands in room 508. I kept reading. The second section of the filing detailed the proposed conservatorship structure. Vernon's 75% ownership stake, my stake, described in the third person, as though I were already gone, would be transferred into a trust established for the protection and benefit of the unborn child. The trust would hold all shares during the conservatorship period, and the trustee designated to manage that trust, to vote those shares, to make every decision about the company I had built over 31 years, was Garrison Prescott. I set the pages down on the hospital tray and stared at the wall. They had built a perfect box. The explosion to weaken me. The pregnancy to anchor the legal claim. A fabricated doctor to certify that I was damaged. And the trust to catch everything when it fell. I was standing inside their architecture, and I could see every wall, every joint, every load-bearing lie. The child who was not mine would legally hold my company. And the man who had fathered that child's attorney, the man who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, would control it as trustee. The beneficiary was not my heir. The trustee was not my ally. And the doctor who had certified my incompetence was a name on a page, purchased like a supply invoice. No different from the falsified records that had been run through my servers from Prescott's own terminal. She was taking everything that was left, and she had built the machine to do it while I lay in this bed thanking her for bringing me clean clothes and telling her I loved the name she had picked for the baby. I picked up my phone. I did not call Cedric. I did not call Lloyd. They were doing their work, and I would not interrupt it with fury. I called Thea. "I need you to think back," I said. "The custody matter with Eleanor, 10 years ago. She used a private investigator. Do you remember his name?" Thea was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Marcus Hargrove. He's still working. I have his number." "Give it to me." Marcus Hargrove, 61 years old. A former insurance fraud investigator who had gone private in 2009, answered on the second ring. I told him what I needed in 4 sentences. He told me his retainer in 2. I told him money was not the problem, and the doctor who had signed a lie about my mind was. "I'll have something for you inside a week," he said. "Make it 3 days," I said. "I don't know when the hearing is scheduled." Hargrove called back in 48 hours, not 3 days. He had already found the clinic where Osborne practiced and confirmed that no appointment under my name had ever been logged. But I needed more than a PI. I needed a lawyer who could stop what was coming. Lloyd had given me 3 names. He said the first 2 were good, but the third was the kind of lawyer other lawyers were afraid of. That was the number I dialed. Lorraine Greer answered her own phone at 7 in the evening, which told me something about her immediately. She was 59 years old, an elder law attorney with a reputation in San Francisco courtrooms for dismantling conservatorship petitions the way a surgeon removes tumors precisely, completely, and without sentiment. I laid out my situation in under 5 minutes. She did not interrupt once. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then speaking, "Mr. Ashford, I have handled 11 conservatorship defenses in the last 4 years. 9 of them involved a spouse. 8 of those involved fabricated medical testimony. I know exactly what this is." "How fast can you move?" I asked. "I will have the opposition filed by 8 a.m. tomorrow and a request for an independent medical examination under Probate Code 1826 by noon. The court will appoint its own physician. When that physician examines you and finds a cognitively intact man with burn injuries and a fraudulent assessment on file, Dr. Osborne's signature becomes a liability for everyone who relied on it. I had spent 2 months lying in a hospital bed, playing the fool while my wife dismantled my life piece by piece. And now, for the first time, I had someone in the room who knew how to build it back, one legal filing at a time. "I am coming to you tonight," Lorraine said. "Do not speak to anyone about this petition until I arrive." She was at room 508 within 90 minutes. carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a wool coat that brought November night air into the sterile room like a gust from a world where things still functioned according to rules. She set the briefcase on the visitor chair, put silver reading glasses on her nose, and read the conservatorship petition from first page to last while I drank a glass of water and watched. It was the first glass I had finished in days. I realized that thirst returns when hope does. When she finished reading, she set the petition on the tray table, uncapped a pen, and opened her legal pad. The scratch of her handwriting was sharp and deliberate, and the red light of her recorder blinked beside my untouched dinner. "From this moment forward, you do not sign anything," she said. Her voice was measured and unhurried, each word placed like a brick. Not a medical release, not a business document, not a get-well card. Nothing with your name on it until I tell you otherwise. Understood? Understood. Good. Now tell me, what documents has Celeste had you sign since the accident? The question hit me like cold water. I thought back through the haze of painkillers and recovery. The supplier contracts Celeste had brought in the first week. The insurance forms. The power of attorney update she had slid across my lap on day 3, telling me it was a routine renewal. Every signature, every form she had, brought to my bedside with a pen and a smile and a soft explanation that it was just paperwork, just housekeeping, just something that needed my name. Every single one was a weapon she had put in my hand and aimed at my own head. "That," Lorraine said, watching my face, "is exactly what I intend to find out. Every signature you have given her since September is now evidence. If any of those documents transferred authority, altered ownership structures, or modified fiduciary arrangements while you were under the influence of opioid pain medication, they are voidable, and I will void them." She packed her briefcase with the copies I had made of the petition and stood to leave. At the door she paused, one hand on the frame, and turned back. "One more question. Have you ever heard of a company called Meridian Pacific Holdings?" I had not. It appears 17 times in the conservatorship filing as the proposed asset management entity, the company that would hold your shares, manage your properties, and administer the trust during the conservatorship period. She let that settle. It was incorporated 6 days ago. Someone built a company specifically to receive everything you own, and they did it less than a week before this petition was filed. She left. The door closed. The recorder light was still blinking red on the tray table, and I stared at it and thought about a company that was 6 days old and already named 17 times in a document designed to take my life apart. Meridian Pacific Holdings. I said the name out loud in the empty room, and it tasted like nothing. Which is exactly what it was. A hollow vessel built to swallow everything I owned. But before I could trace it further, Lloyd called, and the shape of everything changed again. Lloyd Callahan had never raised his voice in 40 years of friendship. So when he called that Tuesday morning and said, "Vernon, sit down," I did not argue. "I traced the payments to Stanton," he said. $68,000 over 18 months, routed through 3 intermediary accounts. 2 of them are the same shell structure we saw with the falsified invoices. Where does it originate? A charity called the Bay Area Community Assistance Fund. Its listed purpose is Community Seafood Access Programs. He paused. It has never distributed a single meal. I closed my eyes. A charity that existed on paper and nowhere else. Funneling money to the detective who had searched my hospital room at midnight. "Who runs it?" I asked. "The executive director is Deputy Chief Clyde Norris, SFPD. I let that settle. Norris was not a name I knew, but his rank told me everything. A deputy chief sits at the command level. He controls which detectives get assigned to which cases. He decides what gets investigated and what gets buried. The man who had sent Stanton to my room was not a rogue cop or a freelance fixer. He was the senior commander running a laundering operation through a fake charity. And he wore a badge while doing it. a charity for community seafood access that has never fed a single person, and the man who runs it commands the detectives who came to my hospital room in the middle of the night. I had spent my career working alongside harbor master offices and port authorities and fish and game enforcement. I had trusted the system because the system had always worked for me. It was not working for me anymore. Before I tell you what happened next, if you are still with me right now, drop your guess in one sentence. Who do you think is really running this operation? Prescott or someone above him? Some details ahead are dramatized for narrative impact, but the lesson underneath is real. Lloyd was still on the line. I could hear him breathing the way he breathes when he has more to say and is deciding how to say it. Vernon, listen to me. You have a dirty cop, a dirty deputy chief, a dirty lawyer, a wife who tried to have you killed, a shell company built in 6 days to catch your assets, a fake doctor signing lies about your mind, and a baby that is not yours being used as a legal weapon. His voice was flat and hard, stripped of its usual Monterey ease. This is not something Lorraine Greer can fix in a courtroom. This is not something Hargrove can solve with surveillance photos. This needs the federal government. I had built Ashford Coastal Kitchen from a single Fisherman's Wharf counter into 18 locations and a supply chain that stretched from Alaska to Baja. And now that empire had attracted the kind of predators who wear badges and carry briefcases instead of weapons. They had come for me not with violence, although they had tried that too, but with paperwork, patience, and the quiet confidence of people who believe the system belongs to them. I already walked into that office, I said. 3 weeks ago. The line went silent. You what? The day I got the DNA results. I drove to 450 Golden Gate Avenue and gave them the hard drive, the invoices, the server logs, the conservatorship draft. Everything I had at the time. Vernon! Lloyd's voice cracked for the first time in 4 decades of friendship. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed you focused on the numbers, not worried about what the FBI was doing with them. Another silence. Then, go back, today. Bring the Stanton payments, bring the Norris connection, bring the charity filings. Bring everything we have found since your first visit, and this time, do not leave until they assign a case agent. I will. Today, Vernon. Not after the hearing. Not next week. Today. I hung up the phone. The hospital room was quiet. The IV stand stood beside the bed like a metal skeleton, and I reached over and pulled the line from my arm. The tape stung against skin that had thinned over 11 weeks of recovery. I stood up. My legs shook. My ribs burned where the grafts were still healing. I gripped the bed rail until my knees locked, and then I let go. Thea had brought me a suit 3 days earlier. It hung on the back of the bathroom door, carrying a faint scent of home. I put it on. The belt cinched 2 notches tighter than it used to. The jacket sat on shoulders that had thinned, but it fit. I walked out of room 508 without telling anyone where I was going. I made it to 450 Golden Gate Avenue in 14 minutes. This time I did not leave until they assigned a case agent. But I was not the only one making moves that week. Prescott was making his own. And it was the last one he would ever make freely. The call lasted 11 seconds. 4 words and a click. And it was the phone call that ended Garrison Prescott's career. Though he would not know that for another 6 days. I learned what happened next from the FBI's case file. Months later, when the transcripts were entered into evidence, Prescott had seen Lorraine Greer's opposition motion the morning it was filed. He understood immediately that I was no longer lying in a hospital bed waiting to be declared incompetent. I'm fighting. And Prescott did what Prescott always did when a problem surfaced. He called the man whose job it was to make problems disappear. Stanton's phone lit up with a blocked number at 9:47 a.m. He answered because he always answered. "Clean it up, Wade," Prescott said. 4 words. Then the line went dead. Stanton sat in his car in a parking garage on Sansom Street with the engine running. He told the FBI later that he understood the instruction immediately. He had heard those same 4 words before. He heard them the night he deleted the security camera footage from the Fisherman's Wharf flagship. He heard them the night he walked into my hospital room. And now he was hearing them again. And this time the instruction was not about cameras or intimidation. This time cleaning up meant making witnesses quiet and evidence vanish. This time it meant something that would put him in a federal prison for the rest of his working life. 22 minutes. That is how long Wade Stanton sat in that parking garage, deciding whether to be a criminal for the rest of his life or a witness for the rest of the afternoon. The concrete walls pressed in on every side. Exhaust fumes pooled around the car. He smoked 1 cigarette, the first in 3 years, and the taste of it sat stale in his mouth like a decision he had already made. Then he turned off the engine, pulled out of the garage, and drove to the FBI field office at 450 Golden Gate Avenue. The same building I had walked into twice. The same lobby. The same metal detector cold against his belt as he emptied his pockets. He asked to speak to whoever was handling the Ashford case. They brought him to Special Agent Ramona Padilla, a 12-year FBI veteran assigned to the San Francisco White-Collar Crimes Division. She was 44, compact, precise, and she had been quietly assembling my file since the afternoon I had walked in with a hard drive and a DNA report 3 weeks earlier. She turned on her recorder, slid a pen and a legal pad across the table, and asked Stanton to start from the beginning. He talked for 3 hours. 3 hours. That is all it took for a 15-year police career to become a federal confession and for Garrison Prescott's fortress to lose its front door. Stanton confessed to deleting the security footage on the night of the explosion. He named the specific cameras and the exact timestamps Prescott had given him. He confessed to entering my hospital room under Prescott's direct orders. He detailed the payments he had received, the amounts, the routing, the charity that had never served a meal, and then he gave Padilla the organizational chart. Deputy Chief Norris runs the money, he said. His voice was flat, emptied of everything except the need to be finished. Celeste Ashford runs the plan. Prescott runs them both. I was the hands. He looked at the pen on the table. I am done being the hands. Padilla wrote it all down in handwriting that never wavered. The interview room smelled of institutional carpet and government-issue coffee, and Stanton drank water from a paper cup and gave her everything. When he finished, Padilla closed her notebook and looked at him with an expression that was not sympathy and was not contempt. It was the expression of a federal agent who has just been handed the last piece of a case she has been building in silence. Detective, there is something you should know, she said. Vernon Ashford walked into this office 3 weeks ago with a portable hard drive, server logs, financial records, and a DNA paternity report. We have been building a parallel case the entire time you were sitting in that parking garage deciding what to do. Stanton stared at her. You are not the first domino, Padilla said. You are the last one we needed. Stanton was the last domino. With his confession, the FBI had everything, the financial trail, the server logs, the paternity fraud. And now a cooperating insider who could name every player in the conspiracy. But there was one more witness they needed, and she was standing on a sidewalk, unable to move. Bryn Hollister was 28 years old and had never broken a law in her life. She stood outside 450 Golden Gate Avenue for 14 minutes because she was not sure whether walking through that door would make her a hero or a criminal. I was not there. I was back in room 508 by then, the suit hanging on the bathroom door again. My body reminding me with every breath that 11 weeks of recovery does not disappear because your mind decides you are finished being broken. But Cedric was in contact with Bryn, and he told me everything that happened. Sometimes in real time by text, and sometimes in long calls afterward when the adrenaline had drained and the details came back with the sharp clarity of survival. Bryn stood on that sidewalk, watching people enter and leave the federal building. She had 31 videos on her phone. Every one of them documented a federal crime she had participated in, coerced or not. The camera did not know the difference. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass doors she could not bring herself to push open. Cedric told me later what it cost her to walk through that door. She had not slept in 3 days. She had packed a bag and left it in her car in case she was arrested, and did not come home. She had written a letter to her mother explaining everything. The job, the invoices, the recordings, the woman who had smiled at her in a conference room and turned her into the public face of a criminal operation. She had sealed the letter and put it in her glove compartment next to the bag. Then she counted to 10, crossed the lobby, and spoke to the woman at the front desk. "I am here to see Agent Padilla," she said. "My name is Bryn Hollister. I work for Ashford Coastal Kitchen, and I have evidence of federal crimes." She asked for Padilla by name because Cedric had given it to her. Because I had given it to Cedric. Because the network we had built, in hospital rooms and midnight drives and whispered phone calls, had done exactly what it was built to do. Deliver the right person to the right door at the right time. Padilla brought Bryn to the same interview room where Stanton had sat days earlier. The old carpet scent of the building mixed with coffee Bryn could not bring herself to drink. She placed her phone on the cold metal table with hands she pressed flat against her thighs to stop from shaking. And she opened the video folder. Padilla watched the first recording in silence. Crates being relabeled at the Fisherman's Wharf dock. Origin documents swapped. Timestamps and dock numbers visible in the corner of each frame. She watched the second recording. More crates, different dates. The same operation repeated with mechanical precision. She watched the third recording, and halfway through it she leaned forward. In the background, standing near a loading bay door with his hands in his coat pockets, was Garrison Prescott. 3 videos. Padilla watched 3 of the 31 recordings, and that was enough. She stopped the playback, picked up her desk phone, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of an institution. Preparing to move. "Get Noah on the line. And loop in DEA. The money trail crosses into controlled substance territory through the shell accounts." Bryn sat very still. The phone lay on the table between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Padilla turned back to her. "These are Lacey Act violations," Padilla said. "Mislabeled species, falsified country of origin, interstate transport of illegally documented seafood. Every one of these videos is a separate federal count. You brought us 31. I recorded them because I did not know what else to do," Bryn said. "They told me it was a coding update. I knew it was not." Padilla nodded. Then she told Bryn she would be placed under federal witness protection effective immediately. Bryn's shoulders dropped for the first time in what Cedric said looked like weeks. But Padilla was not finished. She opened a second file on her desk, thick, tabbed, my name printed on the cover, and turned it to face Bryn. Inside was something that made Bryn cover her mouth with both hands. The FBI had recovered the security camera footage from the night of the explosion. The footage Stanton believed he had deleted. It had been backed up to a cloud server he had not known about. The explosion had been caught on film. The recovered footage showed everything. A figure near the gas line at 2:14 a.m. A timer. A departure through the service alley. The FBI had their arson evidence. 3 federal agencies were now moving in parallel, and I was still lying in a hospital bed. That ended on a Tuesday morning in early December. The suit I wore out of that hospital was the same one I had worn to my first major supplier contract signing in 1997. Navy blue, single-breasted. It still fit. Barely. Because 91 days in a hospital bed will take 30 pounds off a man who used to carry them with pride. The shoulders sat loose where muscle had been. The belt cinched to the same notch I had punched the week before, but I buttoned it and walked. I signed the discharge papers at the nurse's station and picked up the cardboard box Thea had packed for me. It was not heavy. It held the DNA report, copies of the conservatorship petition, Lorraine Greer's opposition filings, and a photograph of Eleanor that Thea had brought me in October. Everything that mattered fit in a box I could carry with one arm. Lloyd was waiting at the curb in his truck. The cab smelled of Monterey and old leather, and when I climbed in, he looked at the box on my lap. "That everything?" he asked. "That is everything that matters," I said. We drove in silence for 3 miles. The hospital air was behind me. December San Francisco came through the cracked window. Salt and diesel off the Embarcadero. Cold morning air that tasted like freedom after 3 months of recycled atmosphere. Lloyd had bought coffee at a drive-thru. I held the cup but did not drink. The Embarcadero had not changed. The bay was still there. The ferries still ran. The tourists still photographed the bridge. My name was still on the building at the corner of the waterfront, even if the woman inside it was trying to scratch it off. "Where do you want to go?" Lloyd asked. "Take me to the office," I said. "Take me home." Lloyd parked across the street from Ashford HQ. I got out of the truck and stood on the sidewalk with the cardboard box under my arm. I looked up at the building I had leased in 2003, expanded in 2011, and renovated after Eleanor died because I needed something to do with my hands. I did not go inside. Through the second-floor conference room window, I could see her. Celeste stood at the head of the boardroom table, gesturing at a projected slide. 6 figures sat around the table. Board members I recognized, people who had eaten at my table for 20 years, people who had come to Eleanor's funeral and shaken my hand and told me the company was in good hands. She was presenting slides titled, "Ashford Coastal Kitchen Restructuring Proposal." She was wearing the pearl necklace I had given her on our 2nd anniversary. On a Sunday morning in Sausalito when she had cried and I had believed the tears, standing on that sidewalk. I wondered if she had practiced crying the way I had practiced being weak, and which one of us had been better at it. She had taken my chair. She was wearing my pearls and sitting in my seat and selling my company to a room full of people I had trusted. And she was doing it with the same calm confidence she had used to slide documents across my hospital lap and tell me it was just paperwork. Lloyd put his hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm. The grip of a man who has known you for 4 decades and can read the set of your jaw from 3 feet away. "Not yet," he said quietly. "Let her finish. Let her think she has won." I stood there. The cardboard box pressed its edges into my forearm. My shoes met concrete for the first time in 91 days, and the ground felt solid in a way I had forgotten ground could feel. I watched my wife pitch a restructuring plan for a company she had tried to steal from a man she had tried to kill, and I said nothing. Then I heard car doors open behind me. Not 1, 4, in sequence. The sound of a coordinated arrival. A black SUV with federal plates had pulled into the loading zone. Agent Padilla stepped out first, followed by 4 agents in dark windbreakers with yellow letters across the back. She looked at me. She looked up at the conference room window where Celeste was mid-sentence, one hand extended toward her slide. "Mr. Ashford," Padilla said, "you might want to step inside. You are going to want to see this part." I followed Padilla through the lobby and up the stairs I had climbed 1,000 times. The agents fanned out behind me. My shoes hit the tile and the sound echoed off walls that still carried my name on the lease. I pushed the conference room door open with the flat of my hand, and every head at that table turned toward me except one. Celeste's eyes went to the cardboard box first. She was standing at the head of the table, my chair pushed back behind her, my projector throwing her slides onto my wall. 6 board members sat frozen in their leather seats. The pearl necklace I had given her caught the overhead light. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I walked to the head of the table. She stepped aside. I did not sit. I set the cardboard box on the polished mahogany and opened it the way a surgeon opens a case deliberately, without hurry, knowing every instrument inside had a purpose. I placed the first document on the table. 16 invoices, I said. Your authorization code, routed to suppliers that do not exist. I placed the second. A shell company traced to a trust in your name. incorporated 14 months before the explosion. The third, a conservatorship petition built on a cognitive assessment signed by a doctor I have never met. I placed the DNA report face down on the table. I wanted her to know before I turned it over that I already knew, and that every person in that room was about to know too. "Vernon, I can explain," she said. "You did not build this chain, Celeste," I said. "You only used it." I turned the DNA report face up. She looked at it. Her face lost color from the chin upward, the way a tide recedes. The room was silent. 6 people who had known me for 20 years sat in their chairs and did not breathe. "And the child you are carrying is not mine." The words left my mouth and fell into the room like stones dropped into still water. Celeste's hand went to the edge of the table. Her perfume was sharp in the air between us. The same scent that had lingered on the pillow she brought to my hospital room. The same scent I would never be able to separate from betrayal for the rest of my life. The boardroom door opened again. Agent Padilla stepped through it, with a federal warrant in one hand and her badge in the other. 2 agents flanked her. The yellow letters on their windbreakers filled the doorframe. "Celeste Ashford, you are under arrest on federal charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit arson, and violations of the Lacey Act," Padilla said. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." 6 board members. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them moved. They watched Celeste escorted away from the table she had been commanding 30 seconds earlier. And the only sound in the room was the click of handcuffs and the hum of the conference room projector still displaying her restructuring slide. As Celeste passed me in the doorway, she looked at my face. She was searching for something. Anger, satisfaction, grief. I gave her nothing. I had spent 91 days learning how to show nothing. And this was the final exam. Padilla's radio crackled as the agents led Celeste down the stairs. "Target 2 in custody," the voice said. "Prescott apprehended at Sausalito Marina. Slip 14. Attempting to board a 40-foot yacht. Vessel registered to Meridian Pacific Holdings." The yacht he was fleeing on had been purchased with the money he stole from me, registered to the company built to receive my assets. His escape vehicle was my money. He had spent 7 years engineering the theft of my empire, and he needed 1 more year to finish it. He did not get that year. I turned to the 6 board members still seated at the table. They looked at me the way people look at someone they have underestimated and are now recalculating. "My name is still on this building," I said. "I believe you were in the middle of a meeting." They filed out in silence, one by one, until I was alone. The projector was still running. Celeste's final slide glowed on the wall behind me, in blue and white Ashford Coastal Kitchen. A new chapter. I stood in the room where I had signed my first expansion deal, where I had toasted Eleanor's birthday, where I had once believed that the hardest part of my life was behind me. The adrenaline was fading. The victory was quieter than I had expected. I reached over and turned the projector off. The victory was quieter than I expected. I stood in that empty boardroom for a long time after the projector went dark, and the silence did not feel like triumph. It felt like the end of something I could not get back. There is a particular kind of chair they put in federal hallways. Molded plastic, bolted to the floor. Designed for people who are waiting to learn how the rest of their lives will go. I sat in one for 3 hours on a Tuesday in December, while Celeste gave her confession in a room I could not see, behind a door I could not hear through. The fluorescent lights cast no warmth. The hallway stretched empty in both directions. I bought coffee from a vending machine and drank it cold and tasted nothing. My hands rested open on my thighs. They were not fists, not anymore. Padilla came out of the interview wing at 4:17 p.m. She sat in the plastic chair beside me, set her closed notebook on her knee, and held a cup of coffee she did not drink. "She confessed," Padilla said. "Voluntary, full statement, 3 hours." I nodded. "It is not what you expect," Padilla said. She told me what Celeste had described. Prescott had approached her at a Napa Valley gala 7 years ago, not as a predator, but as a consultant. He offered business advice. He offered connections. He built dependency over months of dinners, introductions, small favors that created small debts. By the time the favors became demands, Celeste was too deep inside his architecture to see the exits. Prescott had told Celeste that if she ever tried to withdraw, he would ensure every fraudulent document pointed at me, not at her, not at himself, at me. The shell companies, the falsified invoices, the altered records, all of it would land on my desk, and I would go to prison while Prescott walked away clean. I had spent 3 months building a picture of my wife as a monster, and now I was sitting in a federal hallway, learning that the monster had been built by someone else, piece by piece, over 7 years. By the time she understood what she had become, the only door out led through me. She went along with it because she believed him, I asked. She went along with it because by the time she understood what she was inside of, she could not see a way out that did not destroy you first, Padilla said. I sat with that. The institutional air was recycled and carried nothing personal. Somewhere down the hallway, a door closed. Footsteps faded. That does not excuse what she did, Padilla said quietly. I know. But it changes the shape of it. I know that too. Padilla was quiet for a moment. Then she said there was one more thing. At the end, before she signed the statement, she asked me a question. Padilla's voice dropped lower. She did not ask about her charges. She did not ask about bail. She did not ask about the baby. She asked if I was okay. After everything, the explosion, the stolen money, the child that was not mine, the petition to have me declared incompetent, she asked if I was okay. And I did not know what to do with that. I did not know where to put an emotion that was not forgiveness and was not anger, but sat somewhere between the two, tasting like exhaustion. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her you were standing up, Padilla said. I looked at the floor. The molded plastic chair pressed cold against my back. Standing up. That was what Padilla had said. And it was true. And it was the smallest possible version of the truth. I was standing up. I was vertical. I was breathing. Whether I was okay was a question I could not answer in a federal hallway on a Tuesday in December. I sat there for a while longer. The building hummed around me, phones, footsteps, the quiet machinery of an institution that processes human wreckage on a schedule. Then I asked Padilla one question. What happens to the baby? She looked at me carefully. The way someone looks at a man when they are not sure which version of him is about to speak. Under California law, a child born during a marriage is presumed to be the husband's, she said, regardless of biology. Unless you can test paternity, the child will legally be yours. I had the DNA report. I had every right to walk away. I had earned that right in hospital rooms and midnight phone calls and a boardroom where I had laid the proof on the table for everyone to see. I stood up from the plastic chair. The cold curve of it released my back. I did not answer Padilla's implied question. I walked out of the building and into the December air. And I did not look back. I did not answer Padilla's question that day. I walked into the December air and I let the question walk with me. Unanswered. Because some decisions cannot be made in federal buildings under fluorescent light. I went back the next morning because I thought I owed her that. I requested a visit. They brought me to the hallway outside the interview suite and told me she was ready. And then I sat in the plastic chair for 40 minutes and learned something about myself that I did not expect. The door was institutional gray with a small wire mesh window. I could not see through it clearly, but I knew she was on the other side. The hallway hummed with ventilation. The floor had been waxed recently and it smelled like a school at night, empty and purposeful. I rehearsed what I would say. I rehearsed versions of it. One version was angry, the kind of speech a man gives when he has earned the right to be cruel. One version was measured the speech of a businessman closing a chapter. One version was honest, the speech of a 66-year-old man sitting in a plastic chair, trying to understand how 7 years of marriage could contain both real moments and a criminal conspiracy, and whether the real moments survived the discovery or died with it. I sat there for 40 minutes, and in those 40 minutes, I realized that every version of what I wanted to say was for me, not for her. I had spent 3 months learning how to pretend to be weak, sitting in that hallway. I learned something harder, how to be strong enough to leave a conversation unfinished. The anger was still there. The grief was still there. But the need to deliver them to her face, to make her receive them, to watch her absorb them, that need was mine. And carrying it through that door would not make it lighter. It would only make her carry it too. And she was carrying enough. I stood up. My palm pressed flat against my thigh one last time, and then I walked to the desk officer at the end of the corridor. "Cancel the visit, please," I said. "Tell her I was here." The officer nodded. He did not ask why. People cancel visits in federal buildings every day, and the reasons are none of his business. I walked out into the afternoon. December in San Francisco is not cold the way other cities are cold. It is golden and sharp, like a knife made of light, and it cuts through everything you thought you were carrying and leaves you holding only what matters. Lloyd was at the curb. He handed me a coffee through the open window. Real coffee, strong, in a paper cup that warmed my hands. And I climbed into the truck, and he turned the heater on. The cab smelled of Monterey salt and old leather. The same way it had smelled the morning he picked me up from the hospital. The same way it had smelled for 40 years. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask if I went in. He handed me a coffee and turned on the heater and did not ask a single question. That is what 40 years of friendship looks like. It looks like a man who knows when to drive and when to talk and never confuses the two. We drove through the city in late afternoon gold. The bay caught the light and held it. The bridge stood where it always stood. I watched it all through the passenger window and drank the coffee. And it was the first thing I had tasted in months that did not carry the flavor of survival, but something closer to ordinary life. Neither of us spoke. The tires hissed on wet December streets. The silence filled the cab like something solid, like a third passenger who had been riding with us all along and was finally comfortable enough to stay. As we came down toward the waterfront, I asked Lloyd to slow down. The Fisherman's Wharf flagship was behind construction fencing. I had not seen it since the night of the explosion. I expected wreckage. I expected char and absence through the gaps in the fencing. I saw new steel, new tile, new gas lines running clean and straight where the old ones had been sabotaged. Someone had been rebuilding the kitchen. The work was not finished, but it was far enough along that I could see the shape of what it would become. And the shape was the same layout, the same stations, the same kitchen I had built in 1994. Cedric had taped a handwritten note to the front door. The tape was weathered, and the ink had run slightly in the rain, but the words were clear. Open before the new year. Same menu, same owner. Same menu, same owner. I read Cedric's note one more time through the construction fencing, and then Lloyd drove me home. The flagship would reopen. But first there was a conversation I had been avoiding longer than any federal investigation. The hardest conversation I had in all of this was not with the FBI, not with Lorraine Greer, and not with myself in a hospital bed at 3 a.m. It was with my daughter, in my office, on a Tuesday afternoon in late December, when I finally said the words I should have said 2 years earlier. Thea sat across from me in the chair that Prescott had once occupied. Late December light came through the window and fell across the desk between us. She looked older than 34. Not tired, sharpened. The way people look when they have carried something heavy for a long time and are waiting to find out if they can set it down. I should have listened sooner. Thea, I said. Not to your evidence, to you. I should have listened to my daughter. Her jaw tightened. She looked at the desk. She looked at the window. She looked at me. You chose her, she said. Not accusation, fact. I did. For 2 years. Yes. My daughter had carried the truth alone for 2 years because she was afraid I would choose my wife over her. And she had been right to be afraid. Because that is exactly what I would have done. That is exactly what I did. She brought me photographs, suspicions, questions that deserved answers. And I dismissed every one because the alternative was admitting that the woman sleeping in my bed was dismantling my life. Thea did not fail me. I failed her. My voice cracked on the word sorry. It was the only time during the entire ordeal that my voice broke, and it broke in front of the one person who deserved to hear it. Thea was quiet for a long time. Then she laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that releases pressure rather than expressing joy. I do not want to run your company. Dad, she said. I want to have dinner with my father, without wondering who else is at the table. Then come to dinner, I said. Every Sunday. Same table your mother used to set. She reached across the desk and put her hand on mine. I covered it with my other hand and held it there. And the December light moved across the desk between us like a slow tide. In the last week of December, I called a company meeting. The flagship was still under construction, so we met at the Embarcadero headquarters. Cedric stood against the back wall with his arms crossed, the way he always stood at meetings, as if he were guarding the numbers from anyone who might try to round them. Bin sat in the third row with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not look like the woman who had walked into the FBI building unable to breathe. She looked like someone who had passed through the worst thing that could happen and come out the other side with steady hands. I named Cedric chair of a new independent audit committee, with full board authority. No financial decision at Ashford Coastal Kitchen would ever again pass through a single set of hands without independent verification. Then I promoted Bryn Hollister to Director of Supply Chain Compliance. Cedric had kept my books honest for 20 years, and Bryn had recorded the truth on a cracked phone at a loading dock. Between the two of them, they had saved a company that a 66-year-old man had nearly lost because he trusted the wrong smile. This company was nearly destroyed, I told the room, because one person had the courage to record what she saw, and another had the integrity to count what did not add up. They are the reason we are still here. The room applauded. Bryn's eyes were wet, but her back was straight. That afternoon, she framed the first falsified import manifest she had discovered, the document that had started everything, and hung it on the wall of her new office in a neat black frame. I saw it when I walked past her door. It is not a trophy, she said. It is a reminder of what happens when someone decides the numbers do not matter. That evening, after the office cleared, I sat alone at my desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was the DNA report, still in its clinic envelope. I had not filed the paternity contestation. I had not thrown the report away. The envelope sat there the way unanswered questions sit patient, waiting, taking up less space than you think but more weight than you expect. I picked up the phone and called Lorraine Greer. I have made my decision about the child, I said. I told Lorraine I would not contest paternity. The child did not choose its parents. Neither its biology nor its mother's crimes were its fault. I would not raise it, but I would not erase it either. I set up a trust, a real one, clean, with Cedric as trustee, and I would let the child decide, when it was old enough, whether it wanted to know me. The letter arrived on a Monday morning in the final days of December, handwritten on plain white paper with no return address. It contained 2 words that took me longer to read than anything Lorraine Greer had ever put in front of me. I'm sorry. The handwriting was small and careful, centered on the page the way a person writes when they have thought about the words for a long time, and decided that anything more would be a lie. I held the paper between my fingers and felt how thin it was. 2 words, after everything. The explosion, the fraud, the 7-year con, the child that was not mine. She sent me 2 words on plain paper. The terrible thing is, I believed them. I set the letter on my desk beside a framed photograph from 1994. The photograph was yellowed at the edges. In it, a young man stood beside crates of Dungeness crab at Fisherman's Wharf, grinning at a future he could not yet see. He was 35 years old, and he had just signed the lease on his first seafood stall, with money he had borrowed from a fisherman named Lloyd Callahan. He did not know that he would build 18 restaurants, marry twice, bury 1 wife, lose everything to the second, and end up sitting at this same desk 32 years later, holding a letter that said, "I'm sorry. I am 66 years old. I have buried 1 wife, divorced another, survived an explosion meant to kill me, and learned that the child I was prepared to love was fathered by the man who tried to steal my life. And I am still here. That is not strength. That is stubbornness. And I come by it honestly." Prescott received 18 years. Celeste received 6, reduced from 12 for her cooperation. Deputy Chief Norris received 9. Stanton received 3 years of supervised probation and the permanent loss of his badge. Dr. Osborne lost his medical license and received 14 months. The conservatorship was dismissed before it ever reached a hearing. Meridian Pacific Holdings was dissolved by court order. The stolen funds were recovered. Not all of them, but enough. Enough. I went to the wharf at dawn on the morning the flagship reopened. December fog was rolling across the bay, turning the waterfront into a watercolor soft edges. Muted colors. The bridge dissolving into gray where the cables met the sky. The foghorn sounded the way it has sounded for decades, marking the morning the way a clock marks the hour, indifferent to what the hour contains. I stood where my first stall had been. The city had installed a small bronze plaque during the rebuild, set into the concrete at the base of the new entrance. I crouched down and ran my fingers across the raised lettering. It read, "Ashford Coastal Kitchen, established 1994. This site marks the original location." The fog was coming in. It does that in San Francisco. It arrives without permission and stays until it is ready to leave. And you learn to live with it, or you move somewhere else. I have never moved somewhere else. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the years that were real. And there were real years, even with Celeste. Moments that were not strategy, mornings that were not performance. I thought about love without awareness being vulnerability, and awareness without love being emptiness, and how I had spent 31 years learning the first lesson and 4 months learning the second. I intend to carry both. Behind me, the rebuilt flagship opened its doors. I could hear the kitchen crew arriving, the clatter of pans, the hiss of a pilot light catching, the first coffee brewing strong and black. The smell drifted across the wharf and mixed with the salt air. And it smelled like 1994. It smelled like the beginning. Gulls called overhead. The bay stretched out ahead of me the way it always has, patient, indifferent, beautiful. The tide was coming in. The morning was cold on my face. My hands were deep in my coat pockets, and my feet were on the ground, and the ground was solid. I turned around and walked toward the restaurant. The new doors were propped open. The lights were on. Someone had already started the fryer. Through the kitchen window, I could see Cedric counting inventory the way he always counted inventory, carefully, honestly, 1 line at a time. There is work to do. There is always work to do. I went inside. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 6 years trusting a woman who smiled at me every morning and dismantled my life every afternoon. I ignored my daughter when she tried to warn me. I signed documents from a hospital bed without reading them, because I believed the person handing me the pen loved me. Do not make my mistake. Do not let comfort replace awareness. The people closest to you have the most access to everything you have built. And love, without open eyes, is not love, it is an invitation. Some people hear a revenge story and think it is about getting even. It is not. This was never about revenge. This was about a man who had to learn, at 66 years old, that protecting what you built means paying attention to who is standing beside you while you build it. The real revenge story is not the courtroom or the handcuffs. It is waking up the next morning and choosing to keep going. Every revenge story has a moment where the person decides whether to become bitter or become better. I believe God put me through this fire, literally and figuratively, so I could come out the other side knowing the difference between the people who love you and the people who love what you have. That is the lesson no revenge story can teach you until you live it. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done with that DNA report? Would you have walked through that door or walked away? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not already, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. I read every comment and I carry your words with me. Please remember that certain details in this story were fictionalized